Hi, I'm Ben Graham. Welcome to the Global Economy. We're picking up where we left off in supply and demand, and we're starting to talk about the supply curve, right? So in the same sense that demand is the willingness to pay, supply is the willingness to produce and sell, but sort of the willingness to produce a product and put it into the market, right? So just as demand curves slope down, supply curves tend to slope up. The more you'll pay me for something, the higher the price is, the more I'm going to produce and sell, right? You know, at a certain price, I'm not going to work at all, right? The higher that price goes up, the harder I'm working, the more capital I'm pulling in, the more I'm investing in this, and the more I'm producing, right? Okay. And just as when we aggregate individual demand curves into a market demand, we aggregate individual supply curves, we just add them up to get a market supply. All the firms or all the individuals in the market, each of their willingness to produce and sell at a given price, added all together is the amount that will be supplied into the market at that price. Okay, and so if we have demand and supply, and we've got the market demand curve and the market supply curve, now we can get the equilibrium price and quantity, right? And the reason, the reason sort of supply and demand curves are so powerful is you're sort of drawing them on a graph, and then, hey, there's this place where they cross. This is your equilibrium price. This is your equilibrium quantity. We also refer to this as the market clearing price, right? Where it's market clearing in the sense that the same number that is supplied is purchased, right? And there are no sort of excess units left in the market. Nobody's sitting there at the end of the market day still trying to buy stuff. Nobody's sitting there at the end of the market day still trying to sell stuff. Everybody wanted to sell sold. Everybody wanted to buy bought. We're all done here, right? So that's the equilibrium price and quantity. It's simply where the supply curve and the demand curve cross. So now what we really want to look at where things get interesting is when markets are not in equilibrium. Right? And we'll see this for political reasons sort of throughout the course. We'll talk about markets that are out of equilibrium. We will think about things like sanctions and tariffs. We will think about things like minimum wages. We will think about price floors. We will think about subsidies, all these sort of government manipulations of markets that are going to lead to surpluses and shortages. Okay, so when you have a price that is above the equilibrium price. So you've got your market clearing price. And if for some reason you're artificially setting the price high, let's say the government establishes a price floor, right? So I grew up in a wheat producing state in Idaho. And for quite a while, the government maintained a price floor for wheat. They wouldn't let it fall below a certain dollar value per bushel. And so what that did was that price floor produced a surplus, right? Where at a particular price, the supply, let's imagine that this is $2.50 a bushel for wheat, right? And that, so you've got farmers who are willing to sell 10 million bushels here, but consumers at $2.50 a bushel were only willing to buy 4 million bushels, right? And so now you've got this 6 million bushel surplus. Well, what's happening with that? The way the government's maintaining this price floor is they're this buyer of last resort. They're buying up all this extra wheat, throwing it in a warehouse, and then figuring out how to unload it later. Right, so you'll have this surplus. If you set the price artificially high, you're going to get more production than consumption. You'll have this surplus left over. Similarly, sometimes you see governments put in place a price ceiling. Right, we saw this in the 70s with the gas when Jimmy Carter put a ceiling on gasoline prices during the oil price shocks. We had an oil embargo and gas prices shot up in the United States. Everybody's really mad about the gas price being high. So Jimmy Carter said, oh, gas stations, you have to sell the price lower. Well, what did that mean? That meant there were a lot of people who were willing to buy gas at that price and not so many people willing to sell it. And so you had this major shortage and you had these long lines outside of gas stations, people waiting in line to get their gasoline. And you see this actually happen a lot where governments will put price ceilings on staple items like bread or flour or something like that, which is fine. It's limiting the price that consumers are paying, but then you're going to still be rationing that product. And instead of rationing it by price, you're going to ration it by people waiting in line, that sort of thing. You're going to have shortages. More people want to buy it at this price than are able to. So that's markets out of equilibrium. let's go back to sort of this movements of a curve and movements along a curve, but in the context of a full graph with both of these curves in place, right? So we'll talk a lot in the class about supply shocks and demand shocks in different markets. And this picture gives us sort of an idea about a demand shock in the ice cream market. So this demand shock is simply weather, right? It turned out to be a hot, sunny day. Now all of the USC students wandering around campus really want an ice cream cone, right? So their willingness to pay for ice cream is much, much higher when it's 95 degrees out than when it's 55 degrees out, right? 55 degrees, I don't really want an ice cream cone. 95 degrees out, man, I want ice cream. I'm really willing to pay for it. So the whole curve is moving out. At any given price, I will buy more ice cream when it is hot, right? And so what that's going to do is we're going to get, so here we're assuming that as temperature changes, supply curve's staying put, right? We're not seeing a supply shock here. The people sort of selling ice cream, their costs of production are still the same as they ever were. Their labor costs are still the same. So their willingness to sell ice cream hasn't changed here, but people's willingness to pay has changed. And so as that demand curve moves, what you'll see about the equilibrium price and quantity is that the equilibrium quantity is going up, right? People are buying more ice cream and they're going to be paying more for it as well, right? So that equilibrium price and quantity are going to increase when we get a positive demand shock, right? If that supply is staying constant. But that's a big if, right? Is that supply staying constant? Fortunately or unfortunately for us as scholars of international relations, the world's a very complex place, right? And you often get supply and demand moving about at the same time. A shock to one will often affect the other, right? And so what you might see here, let's look at this picture on the left where we've got a large increase in demand and a small increase in supply, or I'm sorry, a small decrease in supply. So we can look at this in like the ice cream example. Let's say that hot weather really made people want a lot more ice cream, but it actually made the people selling ice cream a little less willing to work. They wanted to be outside sunbathing. They didn't actually want to be at work selling ice cream that day because it was such a nice day out, right? So their willingness to supply actually got a little bit lower. They were less willing to work and sell ice cream, and people were more willing to pay. Okay, so you're going to have both of these changes sort of moving things, moving that price up. But what you can think about is as we are increasing demand, prices going up and quantity demanded is going up, or yeah, quantity demanded and the equilibrium quantity are going up, right? As you're moving that demand curve and moving that along. As that supply curve is going in, price is also going up, right? But you're actually driving the quantity back down, right? And so the total, sort of the net, when you have both these curves moving at once, the net effect on quantity, well, it depends on how steep each of these curves is, right? How elastic supply and demand is. We'll keep circling back at that term, but how steep or how flat that curve is. We also talk about how elastic is the supply or how elastic is the demand. And when we have a small move in one and a large move in the other, right, we have to sort of look at how steep the curves are, how big the moves are. In this particular example, right, we're getting price going up quite a lot and we're getting a more modest increase in quantity. And then we can say, hey, what if we had this large decrease in supply? What if that hot weather made people really not want to work, but it only made people a little more interested in ice cream, right? If that was sort of the effect on preferences, then we're still going to get a large increase in price, right? Because both of these effects are moving in that direction, pushing the price up, but we might actually see total quantity go down, right? So if you've got offsetting effects, what's your net effect going to be? It depends on which effect is larger, right? So the world is a pretty complicated place. And when you have a major event, whether that's a weather event or whether that's a global recession or whether that's a war or something like this, right? The effects on, it's probably, war breaks out, you're going to affect both supply and demand in a lot of markets. And so what ends up happening to equilibrium price and quantity depends on the relative size of those shocks. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about in today's lecture is the idea of complements and substitutes, right? Which is also something we'll be talking a lot about. So when we're thinking about things that affect prices in a market, supply and demand are really the key features, and the availability of complements and substitutes are going to play an important role as well. So two different goods, because the reality is just as we don't only have a movement to supply or only a movement to demand, usually these curves are both moving. It's also the case that we don't just have a market for one good, right? We have markets for multiple different goods going on at once, and these markets affect each other. Complements and substitutes help us understand how different markets affect each other. And so two goods are complementary if consuming one item increases the demand for the other, right? Which is to say, if I already own a gun, or if I go and buy a gun, my demand for bullets increases because I am buying the gun, right? Similarly, if I buy a computer, my demand for IT services is going to increase because I own the computer, right? So these are complementary goods, right? Where my consumption of one positively affects my consumption of the other, right? If I have a bunch of chips, I may increase my demand for salsa, right? These complementary things. But then there are goods that are substitutes, right? Where if I'm consuming one, it makes me actually less, it lowers my demand for the other good, right? Which is to say, if I'm already eating a steak, it may lower my demand for hamburger, right? Like these things are actually substitutes, right? If the bus gets really cheap and really fast, it lowers my demand, my willingness to pay for a train ride, right? If Uber, runs a big special and I can, get half price rides for a month, my demand for the bus goes down, right? So these things, different types of transportation are substitutes for one another. Similarly, robots and assembly line workers, right? When we introduce industrial robots and those get really good and really efficient, the demand for assembly line workers goes down, right? Firms' willingness to pay for assembly line workers goes down, right? These things are substitutes for one another. If I can get a really good robot, I don't so much need the human worker anymore, right? So those are the principles. I will see you in person in class to run through a bunch of applications, take a bunch of questions, all that sort of thing. Look forward to seeing you soon.